think we've got about 12 members. Pam, what do you think?
I think we probably should just go ahead and then hopefully folks can join us pretty quickly. I'm going to call this meeting to order. Good morning and welcome to the March 8th meeting of the Douglas County Criminal Justice Courting Council. My name is Pam Weegan. I'm the chair of the CJCC. I want to pass on a bit of information regarding how we conduct our meeting in Zoom. We ask that all members please turn on video if you have it. We ask that all members and presenters use good conference call etiquette and mute their line when not speaking. We ask that you please identify yourself each time you speak. If you have a public comment to make during the public comment section of the agenda, please use the raise your hand function on Zoom. The recording of the CJCC meetings are available on the CJCC website after each meeting. Today, we want to formally welcome Chief Lockhart from the Lawrence Police Department to today's meeting. Our first agenda item today is an update on the annual report with the District Attorney, Suzanne Valdez.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to just give you an update on what's happening in the DA's office. And the 2021 annual report, which is the first from the DA's office, that's something I was committed to doing when I took office, has been shared, I think, on the CJCC website. You can also find it on the DA webpage. Hope that you have time to review it, take a look at it and share it with others. It gives a pretty good snapshot of what we accomplished last year in 2021. I want to share that before I get started here, that we have cleared many of our cases from the prior administration, oldie moldy cases, as I call them. And we've also done a lot of work to clear out the COVID backload. So I'm really proud of our team in moving these cases. And I think we're in a really good space as we start 2022. I did have a PowerPoint presentation, but I only have 15 minutes. So I'm just going to do some highlights on the annual report. So the report, I think, is a little bit more detailed. And again, I urge you to take a look at it. Our DA mission is a safe and just community. And I think we've done quite a bit at, like I say, clearing cases, but always keeping public safety at its forefront. And we're doing what we can to ensure that we're committed to a fair and equitable administration of justice for victims and for defendants, of course. We work in transparency, and we believe that when we're transparent, that equates to accountability. So I think that's something that we continue to work up very hard on. And then lastly, I just want to say that our alternatives to incarceration or alternative programs continue to work. We continue to work on those to create robust programs, again, using the criminal justice system only to prosecute the most violent crimes and where defendants feel like they want to go forward with jury trials and have that process in place. So in order to I want to highlight 3 areas in our report that I think are very important to our office, continue to be very important to our office, and that you'll see as a sort of a thread through our report. The first is our victim-focused approach to prosecution. And I want to highlight some areas in that space that we're very proud of and that we continue to focus on. First is our special victims unit. And this unit includes crimes against sexual assault, domestic violence, and sexual crimes against children, and of course, intimate partner violence. We've worked really well with our law enforcement partners, including Lawrence Police Department, who's provided a lot of leadership in that space, to have a partnership where we're working at resolving these cases in a way that victims feel like they're being listened to. They feel like they have a voice. They feel they have control of what's happening in a very, very violent situation in a very trauma-informed way. So shout out to our law enforcement partners, including LPD, KU Public Safety, who have done a fantastic job with working these cases with us. So we continue to look and focus in that space of ensuring that we're victim focused. We also have a wonderful team of victim witness coordinators. We call these 3 individuals the heart of our prosecution team, and they work very hard to ensure that victims, particular and survivors, of course, witnesses are made informed about the proceedings, whatever we're doing with the case. We involve victims and survivors in talking about alternatives to the prosecution of a case. Certainly, they ensure that before we do any charging, especially in the SVU space, that we talk with the victims and survivors, that their voices are heard, and that we communicate with them about how the case is proceeding. So I want to give a shout out to those 3 individuals in our office who, again, really do a lot of work to get our cases where we think they need to be. The other space that I want to focus on with regard to victim-centric or victim focus is our mediation program, criminal mediation, where we're using retired Judge Kevin Moriarty, who has helped us resolve more than 24 criminal matters in our district since last fall. He's trauma informed. He's got years of experience as a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and judge. We work quite well with him, and he's trusted both by our team and certainly by defendants counsel. And he's helped us resolve a lot of cases. So we're going to continue to work with him going forward. And again, to resolve cases and in a way that's trauma informed. The second space that we're really focused on is, of course, our alternatives to incarceration. These are tools that we have in our toolbox. Again, we're trying to meet our mission of ensuring that we get cases resolved quickly, timely, so that victims and survivors feel like they can get a quick resolution and move forward. It also helps with defendants, of course, in making sure that there's accountability on the one hand, and then being able to stay in the community and reduce recidivism. And I think that we're seeing a lot of that happening. Concrete data is something that we're really working on. And since we've just been in this space for about a year, we're going to continue to gather that data and report to you as we start to see some trends. So when we talk about alternatives to incarceration, we really do take a holistic approach to everyone who comes to our criminal justice system. And again, as what we're trying to do is ensure public safety, which is our top priority. I always want to stress that. Accountability for those who do offend, and then reduce recidivism, and then, if possible, reduce the criminal justice imprint. So we're really trying to think about all of those sort of factors as it relates to defendants and to the victims and the survivors. So far, so good. I want to focus next on a couple of alternatives that we're really proud of, that we continue to work with our 2 judges who head up those 2 courts, behavioral health court and drug court. We now have a permanent, what I call a permanent non-prosecutor in our prosecution office. Jim Carpenter started with us last week. He comes to us with about 30 years of experience in the space of doing a lot of mental health care and treatment, just understanding sort of the social justice piece of how we can go about resolving some of these cases. So very excited to have him on board. And those courts continue to evolve with our multidisciplinary team approach to ensuring that we hold people accountable, that we get them the treatment they need and the help that they need. And I was very excited to, we had our 5th drug court graduate last Friday, and those are the best parts of my week when I can attend those graduations. With regard to behavioral court, we have Leonidas, the therapy dog, who has joined behavioral health court as part of the team. And we're glad that he is joining that group and has brought a lot of calm and certainly, I think, happiness and those kinds of things to behavioral health court. Diversions continue to be something that's evolving. We just met with Pam Weegan and her team yesterday. We're trying to ensure that we're always on top of how we go about approving those diversions. We're looking at an enhanced diversion program. We are going to be hiring a diversion coordinator, and that's basically a staff position where that individual will be in a position to really streamline our diversion process. And that's something that's happening as I talk to you now. So diversions continue to be super important. I want to let everyone know, I think the word's got out that we have no tolerance for gun violence. So if there is any crime or incident involving a firearm, we have a 0 tolerance policy on diversions and how we go about prosecuting those cases. And again, this has nothing to do with the Second Amendment. I mean, right to bear arms, this is about reckless use of a firearm when someone shouldn't have it, or where you can have a firearm in an incident, things can go south fairly quickly. So that's our diversion space. Expungements, we continue to work on and increasing kind of visibility on expungements. We really want folks to meet folks in the community. And once COVID now has been kind of ebbing and flowing, as we know, but I really like to get to a space where we're doing these out the library, out in the community, where people feel like they can come in without the intimidation of being in a courtroom or a courthouse. So we are going to try to continue our clean slate clinic with the legal aid clinic at KU. Right now, at least twice a year. We may even get to 3 times a year, but this gives an opportunity for people to clear their records. So we're very excited about that. The last thing I want to talk about is transparency. And that's something that through our annual report, which is we publish, we'll continue to do that. Really using our space with using the website, using our social media, whatever we can do to let people know what we're doing, how we're doing it, policies, procedures, all those kinds of things are super important to us. We believe that if we're transparent, it makes us accountable. So we will continue to do that. We've got our PIO, the new position that was hired, that I hired last year, Jill Jess, who does a fantastic job working with the community, getting information out with our law enforcement partners as well, and our community partners. So she's doing a lot of all the heavy lifting on that. Social media continues to evolve. We have our data dashboard, which we're really proud of. That was launched, of course, in August or September. That's going to continue to evolve, and we're going to watch that data to help us and inform us on how we go about evolving our office. The last thing I'll talk about is training and hiring. And then I want to just mention quickly our goals for 2022. So you know what they are, and then you can hold us accountable for those things. Hiring and training. We are now, I think, almost full staff with prosecutors. We are down 1 prosecutor. We're looking for an SVU prosecutor, and then probably a new attorney who will graduate at some point, sort of, kind of starting in August after the bar exam. Very proud of that. Most prosecution offices across the country, it's hard to find folks who want to be cops and be in law enforcement. It's hard to find prosecutors. So I know one city in the East Coast is got about 400 prosecutors at full staff. They're down 200. So it's just hard to find people who want to do this kind of work. So I'm really proud of the people that we have, and we've got an amazing team of folks here who are working together for what we do for our community. We continue to train, we continue to onboard. We are very want to continue doing training with our law enforcement partners, community partners. So if you have any ideas of things that we should be doing or like us to talk, come out and talk to you, we'd love to do that as well. So the last thing I wanted to chat with before I let you before I'm done here is our goals for 2022. We have many of them, but these are our highlights. We want to continue with our alternatives to incarceration, our alternative programs, like I talked about earlier, continue to have those evolve, make them more robust. Really want to, we're working on restorative justice with Building Peace. Many of you have probably seen some of the press releases on that. We're going to start with our juvenile offenders, but I also want to talk, think about expanding it into sexual assault. And I'll talk about that in just a second, because I think that's a way to make, to restore some to use those tools in those kinds of cases as well. It's very cutting edge, but I think it can be productive and constructive. We also want to continue with our criminal mediation program involving Judge Moriarty and resolving cases, high-level cases short of trial. The other thing we want to focus on this year is our University Task Force on Sexual Violence. That will be a task force made up of students from KU, Baker, and Haskell. It'll be completely student-run. It'll be launched fall of 2022. We have students who are interested. The point is that students get to drive the agenda. They get to drive this conversation about how we go about charging and handling cases in our SVU. And again, restorative justice is a space that they're very interested in exploring. So that is why we're going to have them talk about that and give us some advice on how we should go, or if we should go forward with restorative justice. And then lastly, we want to continue our community outreach with GARE. That's we're working with GARE to make sure that we're meeting our what we need to do with GARE, and that's very important. And certainly now that COVID, I think, has sort of on the down low for a while, we want to have community conversations, meet the community out in a space outside of the the courthouse and tell you what we're doing and get your ideas and hear what you have to say. So those are kind of the three big goals. We have other things that are in the works, but those are the three main ones. So I'm not sure how much time I have, but I'll leave it open for questions, or if you want to wait till the end of our time together, I'm fine with that as well. Sorry, I spoke really fast, but I only had 15 minutes.
Hey, we really appreciate the quick recap. Does anybody have any questions for Suzanne while we're talking about it?
So there is a question in the attendees. I'm gonna allow them to talk now. Gail? Gail, are you still there? Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Gail Hughes. I'm new to Douglas County. I look around the group and I see a very impressive group, but I was chief of probation and parole in Missouri for 20 years and was on Reno's sex offender management team, was appointed by the president, and did 16 years of consulting with the U.S. Justice Department. And from that background, when I look around the group, very impressive group, but when we talk about alternatives, I wondered why probation wasn't represented at the table on this discussion. Because in Missouri, because I was chief for that long a time, I sat with this kind of group continuously to look at alternatives that we could assist each other in offering. So I guess if I have anything to say, and I'm a young kid on, not the young, but I'm a new kid on the block. And I'm doing some things with the justice matters of the Methodist Church is where I have put my foot in at this time. So I don't know whether this committee would think probation to be appropriate or not, but I leave that to your good judgment because this is the second time I've sat in and I'm very impressed with this group of people.
Gail, let me reassure you, probation is represented. I represent probation, and so is the Chief Court Service Officer, Suzanne Mickelman's also on this committee. So we're well represented.
Well, okay, and Pam, I'd like to meet with you sometime and talk about probation.
Happy to
I'd even buy lunch.
I appreciate that. I'll meet with you anytime. Please give me a call.
I will.
Thank you.
That's all I have to offer, but thanks for being patient with me to let me offer that.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from the council? Thank you again, Suzanne. And moving on, our next agenda item is the driver's license reinstatements and Kansas Legal Services role in that process. This is a big issue. We have 5,109 licenses in Douglas County that are currently suspended. Welcome, Melissa Nolte and Marilyn Harp.
Hi, thanks for this opportunity. We have absolutely taken on this driver's license issue as an issue. A part of the issue is definitely a low-income person issue. And so I know you all, you've mentioned the 5,000 people in Douglas County. Interestingly, nationwide, the number of people with suspended driver's licenses has doubled in the last 15 years as courts and legislator, I mean, as the legislature led, I think often by courts, have decided that suspending driver's licenses is maybe a way to get people to pay their fines. So over time, that's just taken off. We have been involved in a couple of ways, both providing information on our website in what we hope is a systematic way, as well as being part of community events where we rally our staff and train some volunteers to look at people's individual situations and give them a roadmap for what they might do to get to a point where they have access to a full driver's license. But I just want to say, for those of you who, well, and we've also been a part of making some suggestions about legislative changes. And many of those have paid off. So if anybody's aware of the restricted driver's license program of 5 years ago, it is really very transformed at this point. So it is still only 1 year. And that is something that might well benefit from a change. But for example, we used to be in a situation where if your driver's license had been suspended and then you let it expire, you could not participate in the restricted program. If you didn't have the $25 to pay, you could not participate. All that's gone. So if you've ever had a valid driver's license in Kansas, you can participate in the restricted program. It is now free to apply for the restricted program. Restrictions on where people can drive are somewhat similar to what young drivers can do: to and from work, to and from school, to and from court required activities, to and from medical appointments. And there's talk this year of adding to and from religious activities to that restriction as well. So we'll see if the legislature does anything with that. But restricted is a huge option to give people a year of legal driving while they work on these other things. And what can they do about other things? So last session, the legislature, for district courts and for municipal courts who opt in, gave courts the ability not only to waive reinstatement fees, which they've had for a while, but also to waive or reduce fines and fees based on a finding of manifest hardship on the person and their immediate family. So there are motions that we provide to people to ask the courts to do that. And I think what this group could do, I mean, on the court side and the community side, is come up with some agreement about what might constitute manifest hardship. So of course there's a financial side to that, and Kansas Legal Services has promoted 125% of the federal poverty guidelines as what might on a financial side constitute manifest hardship. It just gives some predictability, and yet it also gives over time, it raises every year if it's tied to something like the federal poverty guidelines. But there are other factors that people have found. For example, a family that is encountering a huge amount of medical debt or some things like that might still have some income, but might be found to have manifest hardship. So something in place to make sure that fines and fees can happen. I will say that as I went looking for this, if you go and look in the statute book right now, it's not there because the 2021 statutes are not out. But for those legal folks who are wondering, this is an amendment to section 8-2110E1 and 2. And that's where the ability to waive fines and fees comes from. It comes out of Senate Bill 127. So we have done an event in Wichita where about 300 people signed up. We're getting ready to do another event in May in Wichita, but would be happy to talk about doing an event with a community sponsor in Douglas County. So there's that group of people who can get their restricted license, can work on a payment plan and the potential to reduce their fines, fees, and reinstatement fees. One of the things I've said about this and in a restorative justice sort of mode is when we have situations where everybody pays the same fine for speeding, but that is a fine paid by people who have who work 20 hours a week at minimum wage, and people who are our highest earners. That is not a justice system that looks at people's financial situation. This opportunity to take some of those people back who are on the low income side of things back in is definitely a restorative justice sort of option. I will also say that as we do this in other places, prosecutors have felt like they have done their job when they get the fines and fees set, and that the issue of reducing those fines and fees based on the person's financial situation is not something that prosecutors have felt like they should get into in other places. Court administrators and so that we're dealing with the clerks and judges are who we've been working with primarily on the fines and fees waiver process. It's another group of folks who run into trouble getting, aside from getting fines and fees dealt with, people who've had an uninsured accident, and we've provided some information about those folks. There are some options for those folks. People who have people who have DUIs as part of it certainly show up at these events. I would just say that those folks have sort of different situations. There are different obstacles there, and for the most part, we try to find a specialist in those to deal with folks because they have a different situation. Habitual violator is worth speaking about simply because it is such a huge barrier. If someone is if someone at this point is found to have been driving while they have a suspended license 3 times, they have a revoked driver's license for 3 years, and there is nothing that they can do about that. I find it unfortunate that those folks are dealt with in the same way as people who commit vehicular homicide, people who refuse to do a DUI blow test, people who can't pay their fines because they don't have the money, to me, are not in the same category. So there is some legislative effort to deal with, to remove people who don't pay fines from the people who can become habitual violators. But I'm not sure that's going to go anywhere this year. And we reached a deal with the Sheriff's Association about how we would tackle that. But you know, there's a lot of time limits involved, and we need a legislative sponsor to push that, or it will just maybe magically appear. So those things I would just, I would talk about in terms of what our efforts have been. For those of you who are interested in some of this written down, as well as some of the history, I just direct you to the Kansas Legal Services website, kansaslegalservices.org, and search for driver's license. We have a lot of information there. Happy for questions.
Jill.
I just wanted to thank Marilyn and also thank Melissa Nolte. Kansas Legal Services has been a really great partner in the decriminalization of poverty and the larger anti-poverty community health plan. A lot of the things that Marilyn talked about are conversations that have been had with district court and municipal court. A lot of focus on fines and fees and looking at some of the efforts, like Marilyn mentioned, that are happening in Wichita. I think those kind of partnerships seem like low-hanging fruit in a lot of ways. And I recently learned about a partnership or efforts that are underway in Wyandotte Unified Government. They're using American Rescue Plan Act funds to help fund a lot of these efforts. And we also know that there is ECAN has a partnership, has a racial equity grant from the Douglas County United Way this year that is helping to helping folks finance their fines and fees because they're not able to pay them themselves, and acting kind of experimentally to see what kind of an impact that has on some of our most vulnerable populations that they work with. So there's tons of opportunity. I'm really encouraged by some conversations that I've had recently, wearing my anti-poverty community health plan hat with Judge McCabria and Linda Kester-Vogel saying on developing the Court Navigator program, and had a great conversation with some folks with the city last week, I think, or the week before. And I hope that those conversations can continue. I just think there's tons of opportunity with Kansas Legal Services. And I want to thank, again, Melissa and Marilyn for being a part of this conversation and engaging in Douglas County.
Well, we both live in Douglas County, so, you know, it's important to us. Although I have to think about the whole state, you know, Douglas County is special to me, so.
Commissioner Portillo.
Jill took a lot of what I was going to say, so thank you, Jill. Mostly just no sorries at all. I appreciate all the work you're doing on this. Just a big thank you, Marilyn, for everything that you're sharing with us today. I think that the fines and fees piece of really taking a look at the criminal legal system is incredibly important. So I just appreciate all of that work that you're doing for us or with us, and really just wonder what we can do kind of from the county commission level, from the city commission level, like how can local elected officials help you in this work?
So not, you know, at some point, and I appreciate your comments that there are conversations going on with the courts. I don't know how many of these cases are, you know, people are finding their way to our website and filing fines and fees, and I really don't know in Douglas County or the city court if you know, what the rate of seeing those and granting them has been. I know that, you know, one of the things that helps us and helps people just decide to take the time off work to go file it and have their case heard is that somebody else succeeded. So I think that, you know, some of that kind of information can help. I do know that, you know, it's been interesting because the city in Wichita decided to use a form and act on them without people having to take off work. And I mean, they are hearing them without, they're deciding on them without a hearing, which is a huge help for folks. The county decided that they wanted a different form and to see people in person there. But I think that is, again, something courts can, the courts could help decide and let this group know, you know, some general guidelines, or let me know some general guidelines about what they're doing. And then also just, you know, help and get the word out. So if we are able to set up a Sedgwick County event, I'm sorry, a Douglas County event, you know, some publicity through the city and county elected officials can be really helpful.
Suzanne.
So I've been engaged with Fair and Just Prosecution, which is a large national organization, and one of the areas of focus is this space, Maryland. So I really want to connect with you about what we can do. They're trying to come up with guidelines and certain, of course, legislation across the country regarding this issue. So I will make sure I connect with you to see what we can do on our end for what we're doing.
Yeah, I think on this part, I'm pretty happy with the legislation. I think, you know, the habitual we could do more about habitual, but that's well, and I have one other idea, which is, and I'll just throw it out here. Right now, the process requires that the person make a motion both for reinstatement fees and otherwise, and to fines and fees. But sometimes courts find that they dismiss a whole bunch of cases for you know, because they're too old, and the reinstatement fees don't go away because the person didn't come forward. So even though the case was dismissed, the person had to come forward and get rid of their reinstatement fees. So so that's a little like, tune in next year. We may be working on that part of it, but
Any more questions or comments from the council? I would just say, if you're interested in this particular topic, you might want to participate in the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Work Group, or at least attend those meetings where we're talking about these very subjects. You can contact me or Dr. Cravens if you're interested in attending.
Okay,
Great. Great, thank you. Our last item is a presentation with Dr. Jack McDevitt and Janice Iwami, Dr. Janice Iwami about the law enforcement contact study.
Hi, everyone. Okay, great. Thanks so much. Thanks for having us here and talk about the final phase of this study that has been going on in your county for a long time. Do you want to share your screen, Matt? And then we'll walk people through it. I'm happy to take questions as we're presenting or whatever you prefer. For those who don't know, my name is Jack McDevitt. I'm a professor at Northeastern University in Boston. I direct the Institute for Race and Justice and been involved with this study from the beginning. My colleague.
I'm Janice Uwama. I'm an assistant professor at American University in Washington, D.C. and have been working with Jack on this also since about 2019.
So you can go to the next slide. So here's a little bit of background, just a reminder that people or some people who aren't, we've been collecting data. The police departments in Douglas County had agreed to voluntarily collect data on all stops. And that's, if you want to do these kind of studies correctly, you have to have data on all stops. If you just do stops with citations, you end up not knowing exactly what the patterns are. So these agencies have volunteered to collect this data. We have data from January 1st of 2020 to December 31st of 2021. As you can see from this little chart here, there were 20,708 traffic stops during this period. And it gives you a little bit of breakdown of where they're coming from. The largest number of stops were done by the Lawrence Police Department. The Sheriff's Office is second. And you can see the other KUPD, Eudora, and Baldwin. You can go to the next slide, Matt. Thank you. The thing that's different about this study than a lot of the studies that have been done, including the study in Missouri, is that here we're not only going to document any disparities that are there. In other words, a disparity is whether there's a difference between the way people of color are treated and white people are treated in the decisions at traffic stops. But we also have committed to work with the agencies, each of the law enforcement agencies, to drill down into their data and see if we can understand why those disparities exist. Is it something that has to do with a particular area of town? Is it a particular officer or set of officers? And so we're now in the final phase of this report with this visit this past couple of days. We've met with 3, and right after this meeting, we'll meet with the other 2 agencies and talk to them about how we could be helpful in drilling down into their data to be able to show not what disparities exist, but why do they exist and what can be done to reduce those disparities. You can go to the next one. We're going to talk about some of those disparities today with the CJCC, and then, as I said, work with each agency to sort of drill down on that. Some of you are familiar with the Missouri example. They've been doing these kinds of studies in Missouri, and it's been put up annually on the Attorney General's website. The challenge with that is that, knowing that you have a disparity in citations or in searches or in stops doesn't tell the agency where to go and what to do to reduce those disparities. It's sort of up to each individual agency to move forward on its own. Some agencies don't have the technological ability to do that. Some agencies may not have the priority to do that. But what's different about Douglas County is all the agencies have committed to sort of work to really identify these disparities and then try to set motion in part to reduce it. And I will say that in the agencies we spoke to already, people are already doing that. They've seen some preliminary data on disparities, and the agencies are already starting to take some actions to try to reduce those. So it's an exciting process, and I think you all are leading the country in terms of how much you're not only collecting good data, but using the data to change the practice in each of the agencies. Go ahead, Matt.
So we're going to walk you through, and some of this information might be familiar, but this sort of shows you an illustration of the study, the data we're using for the study through the past 24 months. So from January 2020 through December of 2021, as you'll see here, the number of stops have changed in terms of the patterns during that time period, particularly due during the COVID-19 pandemic. Stops dramatically dropped from March 2020 through April 2020, and were also incredibly low during the June and July months. Now, there's a series of different factors that obviously play in outside of COVID-19 that result in either an increase or a decrease in stops. And we sort of try to work with agencies to better understand whether there are policies that are done formally or informally that leads to a sudden increase or a decrease in the number of traffic stops. We focus on three primary bases for stop, the reasons for why an officer is stopping an individual. And we focus on these three because they make up most of the data. They make up most of the reasons why individuals are being stopped by a police officer. This fits the national pattern. We find that for the most part across the country, individuals are being stopped for an equipment inspection violation, speeding, or other traffic violation. And other traffic violations includes such as red light violations, stop signs violations. And so we try to illustrate this because there are some pretty large differences across agencies in terms of why they are stopping individuals. As you'll see in the chart, for the most part, we'll see a pretty general pattern between equipment inspection violations. Some of the agencies are more likely to pull individuals over for speeding 10 miles per hour or greater. And of course, other traffic violations, some agencies are more over to pull somebody over for a stop sign violation, for example, or red light violations. This sort of paints the picture because when we start talking about the racial disparities a little bit, some of the differences between who's being pulled over, we focus on these three narrow areas, which predominantly make up the vast majority of traffic stops in Douglas County.
And just go back 1 minute. Just you can see some things that are different. If you look at the other traffic violation, 38% are from the KUPD. And, you know, that makes sense because they're going to have other kinds of violations of on-campus driving that compare to some place like the sheriff's office and what kinds of stops they're doing. It's also important to note, and we'll come back to this, that when the community worries about whether there's racial profiling going on, they're generally thinking of it in these kind of discretionary stops, like other traffic violation, as Janice said, rolling through a stop sign, or equipment violations, you know, license plate light out. You know, those are high discretion stops, and there may be stops where it's a pretext for pulling someone over.
So this chart illustrates the number of stops, the outcome of those stops that we're talking about during the study period. So the vast majority of stops resulted in a verbal written warning versus a citation. And the reason why we choose this is because we always focus on those disparities that result in a citation due to the financial burden they represent. For the most part, we'll see that all 5 agencies, and we had previously presented the county average, mostly issue verbal written warnings versus citations. We'll narrow this down a little bit more when we're thinking about the basis for stop in terms of what are the differences between 2 individuals being pulled over and one, for example, issued a citation for speeding 10 miles per hour or greater and one issued a warning 10 miles per hour or greater. Those are the specific things that will sort of narrow down our focus in. But for the most part, on average, the county predominantly issues verbal and written warnings. And I will say it's actually very unique to capture this data. And it's important to capture this data about why one individual might get a citation versus a warning. This picture illustrates the percent of people of those stops that were conducted by the 5 agencies during the 2-year study period, and those individuals that fall under individuals of color versus white drivers who happen to be pulled over. As you'll see here, there are some slight differences across the agencies. We try to develop a better understanding for this data by looking at what specifically are the reasons, what are the outcomes, and whether these individuals are specifically undergoing searches and how that differs across their counterparts, white counterparts versus the individuals of color, and what those differences are and whether they're significant. So this illustrates sort of the percent of those individuals that are pulled over for during the 2-year study period across each of those agencies that happen to be individuals of color.
Okay, folks. So this is another one that shows all the agencies and how often they conduct searches. As you all know, searches are one of those areas where people are vulnerable. Searches are a place where people often complain that they're being targeted because of their race or ethnicity or age or gender. And so you can see here that it's fairly consistent across all the agencies in the county. From 3 to 7% of the stops result in a search. So it's a small number of stops, but it is something that we pay attention to, because across the country, the area where we see the most disparities and most consistent set of disparities is who's searched. We see less about who stopped, some about who gets a citation versus who gets a warning, but it's almost in every study, there's a disparity in terms of who's been searched by the police, who's chosen to be searched, and the people of color are more likely to be seen as suspicious and searched. Next one. And here's the reason for the search. So not all searches are alike. So you could have a reason for the search is consent. The officer asks for the consent of the driver gives consent, and that constitutes a reason for the search. Probable cause, the officer, pulls a car over, rolls down the window, smells marijuana, and decides that gives her probable cause to search. And a Terry frisk, where the person is acting in a suspicious manner. There's two other categories of searches where we think of them as less discretionary. One is inventory tow. In other words, if your car is you pulled over, and the conversation we just had about licenses, and you don't have a valid license, they're going to often tow your car. And if they're going to tow your car, they do an inventory search so that you will make sure to get all of the belongings you have in your car back when you get your car back. And then search it incident to arrest. When the person is taken into custody, they're searched before they're taken into custody. And so those are all the different bases of the search that we have. For the analysis of disparities that's coming up next, what we wanted to do was to show you that we're only going to look at those discretionary searches. So the consent, probable cause, and Terry frisk, that's a decision made by the officer at the time. And she's trying to decide, is this a person that is engaged in criminal activity and I need to search them? Whereas the inventory searches and the searches incident to arrest are searches that the policy of the department calls for the officer to search. So we think that if we're looking for disparities, that may be the case, that they're in a more discretionary search decision. Shane, did you have a question?
I did. Before you go to the next slide, do you still have the data, or can we get the data for the search incident to arrest? I know you're calling that less discretionary, but ultimately, doesn't the officer decide what they think they have probable cause to arrest for, unless those are only talking about those who have outstanding warrants?
No, it's a good point. And we can look at that separately, but most of these were outstanding warrants. But
okay,
again, we have to sort of make sure that which ones fall in the probable cause category. Thank you.
So moving forward, when we look at the racial disparities in searches, we're going to narrow down our focus on those that we consider to be based on the officer's discretion. So we'll focus specifically on those searches that are based on consent, probable cause, and Terry frisk.
But we can look at the incident to arrest as well and sort of just see what that is.
You still had your hand raised. I wasn't sure if you had a follow-up question. Okay.
So the other place where since the beginning of the study and across the country, people are anxious and concerned is when they're searched, but nothing's found. And, you pulled over, you're kept there. One of the things about a stop that involves a search is that you're there for between 15 and 30 minutes, as opposed to 5 to 15 minutes. And, you're being searched because the officer believes you're engaged in criminal activity. And so if you're being searched and nothing's found, that tends to be a place where the trust between the police and the community break down. The community member will come back and tell their family and their friends, I was searched by the police, and the only reason I was searched because of who I am. And so you can see that there's a wide variation in how many searches are conducted with evidence not being found across the various agencies. but it's not a rare event for a search to be conducted and no evidence to be found. So this is an area that we're looking at disparities in to see if that happens more often with people of color than it happens with white drivers. Go ahead.
So across the country, national level data indicates that for the most part, when we talk about stops and we talk about searches, they're conducted by a very small concentration of officers, very few number of officers. Obviously, the reasons for that tend to be mostly the assignments of the officers, where they're sort of placed, where they're assigned to. The officers who initiate these stops, obviously some officers tend to initiate stops more so than others. There is a very clear pattern across the country, and not Douglas County alone, but across the country in terms of those individuals who tend to stop more, give more citations, and conduct more searches. During the study period from January 1 of 2020 to December 31 of 2021, about 240 officers across Douglas County conducted these stops. On average, if we were to expect that officers evenly conducted the stops that during the study period, we would expect that each individual officer made about 86 stops. This next couple of figures sort of illustrates where the concentration of stops is and how it's concentrated on a very few number of officers, as we'll show you right now with the stops and the searches.
Go to the next one.
So of those 240 officers, about 58% conducted less than 50 stops during the 24-month period for all of Douglas County. That includes all 5 agencies. Based on these figures and based on the data that had been collected during the study period, if we look at those who made most of the stops, about 7% of the 240 officers conducted more than 300 stops during the 24-month period. So when we think about sort of trying to identify what are some of the solutions to some of the differences that are found, some of the disparities that are found across different types of stops, different patterns, whether it's the outcome or it's whether it's search or no contraband found, no evidence found, we focus specifically on a very small number of officers to try to identify whether there are any challenges at the policy level from agencies or whether individual officers might have something that we need to monitor carefully moving forward in the near future.
Next one.
Here we look at of those number of searches that were conducted during the study period. So during this 24-month period, we found that there were a total of about 1,200 searches that were conducted. Of those officers that actually conducted a search, about 68% conducted less than 5 of those searches. For the most part, we also again found a very small number of officers who conducted the vast majority of searches. So for example, here, if you sort of look at the last 2 figures, about 5% of officers conducted more than 20 searches during the 24-month period. So when we're specifically talking about searches, we're also noticing that it's based on a very small concentration of officers who are actually conducting stops and then those who are later on conducting a search.
You got it. So now we're going to talk about the disparities that we've located and identified. It's important. Some of you who have been with us have heard this over and over again. I apologize, but it's important to note that disparity doesn't mean discrimination. That some disparities may be things that are targeted to a particular enforcement strategy, but they do call for the agency to look at it and know it. Before the agencies collected this data, they didn't know whether there were disparities. It wasn't things they could look at. Now they can look at areas. So let's say in a community, a neighborhood called and said there are cars speeding through the neighborhood, and they're afraid that a young person is going to be hit or killed in the neighborhood. Then the police might issue a whole bunch of citations in that neighborhood. If the neighborhood happens to be a neighborhood of African Americans or Latinos or Asians, then we're going to have more citations of people from those race and ethnicities than from other ones. So that would be a case where it might not be discrimination. By the same token, as Janice just showed you, 1 or 2 officers who were involved with unconscious bias or conscious bias can skew a whole department, because if they're the high volume officers who are doing a lot of searching or doing a lot of stopping and issuing citations. So, what we said from the beginning is that this is an opportunity, the final stage, to drill down and understand what these are and understand how to reduce them if you identify them as something that's concerning. Basically, what we're going to do is take a look at the post-stop decisions today. That means the decision that's after the stop. Here we have a pretty good idea that the officer knows who the individual is. In other words, it's not that it's at night and they pulled someone over and they didn't know who was driving. They've pulled the person over, they've gone up to the car, they have the person's driver's license, so they know the person's name. They've also had a brief conversation with the person at the car. And so they have a lot of information to base a decision about whether or not a person's white or non-white. And so we compare, for each category of stop that Janice mentioned earlier, we're going to say, let's say the likelihood you get a citation. Are there any differences if you're stopped for an equipment violation, let's say, in an agency? Is there any differences between those people of color who are stopped for an equipment violation and those people who are white who are stopped for equipment violation, and in the likelihood that they get a citation rather than a warning? And we use a standard of 2% difference as a difference that needs to have further explanation. So go ahead. And we're looking at today the citation versus warning decision. The second decision is the searches decision that we talked about earlier. That is one of the areas around the country we see so much. And those searches that we looked at the end where nothing was found. And we're looking at that by race and ethnicity and those disparities. Go ahead. So the first thing we looked at, do you want to talk about this?
Sure. So we start looking at the racial disparities in the areas where most of the primary reasons why individuals are being stopped, which of course is equipment inspection violations, speeding 10 miles per hour or greater, and other traffic violations. And we narrow down whether or not individuals are issued a citation in each of these stops. So for example, here we would notice that we focus specifically on KUPD, LKPD, and the Sheriff's Office, primarily because Baldwin and Eudora have such few stops under each of these categories. So if we focus on those that make up the vast majority of the stops under each of these categories. Based on this, we notice that there's about a 1.3% difference in individuals who are pulled over for an equipment or inspection violation and issued a citation as a result. So that's specifically what we're looking at. Chuck?
Yeah, thanks. I have a tough time, as I have in the past, interpreting these percentage figures because we don't know what the base is. I think the convention in this area is to give us, what percentage of Black people are issued a citation, what percentage of white people are issued a citation, and then do a comparison on that as opposed to the difference. I think you're just calculating the difference. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Isn't the convention to give us to calculate a percentage difference based on a base?
That is correct. So we're looking at the total number of stops under each of the categories when we're talking about those white drivers and those individuals of color, right, as being the baseline for the number of stops in this particular situation. So sort of to illustrate your citation for individuals of color, for example, at KUPD, we found that those individuals that were pulled over for an equipment inspection violation, about 5.7% of those individuals were given a citation. Of those individuals who were pulled over for an equipment inspection violation and issued a citation that were white drivers, about 4.4%.
Okay, and then so the first number, the 5.7 was total, right? What's the percentage for people of color? Or did I misunderstand you?
So the individuals of color was 5.7%.
Okay.
And
So the actual difference in conventional terms is quite a bit more than 1.3%.
So it's 5.7% and it's 4.4%.
Right. I'll do before you can go ahead. I'll just do the calculation in the conventional way. Thanks.
So when we're looking at these three agencies, we're seeing some differences between those, and sort of what Chuck was hinting at is when we're calculating these numbers, we're looking at the percent of individuals of color, just completely comparing two separate communities per se. One that happens to be individuals of color, one that happens to be white individuals, and taking the percentage of those who are actually pulled over for an equipment inspection violation and issued a citation. And then we're comparing it to a community that our expectation would be completely white, and one that's also pulled over for an equipment inspection violation and issued a citation, and seeing why there are differences between these two. Now, there could be policy reasons, there could be the time of day, there could be the place, but those are sort of the beginning of a conversation that we're starting at. And Chuck, did you have any more questions?
I don't have a question. I would just observe that a conventional calculation of that difference is that in the case of KU, that's a 30% difference, as is generally reported in this area of research, as opposed to a 1.3% difference. a 30% difference in the likelihood of issuing Black people are 30% more likely to be issued a citation rather than 1.3% more likely. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, Chuck, and thank you. And we can report it both ways. The problem with the 30% is on the small basis that we have. We have to, make sure we're calculating it correctly with small ends. The other thing I would say to people is, if the bar is above the 0, that means more people of color are being getting getting a citation, whereas in Lawrence Police Department, it's more white folks are getting a citation for equipment violations. But Chuck, let's keep the dialogue going, please. We'll go to the next one.
So similar here, when we're looking at racial disparities of those individuals who are issued a citation when they're pulled over for other traffic violations, specifically when we're talking about those such as stop sign violations, red light violations, we're looking at the difference between those individuals who are pulled over versus those individuals of color who are pulled over for this particular reason versus those white individuals who are pulled over for this specific reason. Across the agencies that particularly make up most of those stops, we found that there's a negative disparity for the most part, and there's a positive disparity for the sheriff's office, for example.
You can go to the next one.
When we're looking at the racial disparities across those individuals who happen to be pulled over for speeding and issued a citation after they're pulled over for speeding 10 miles per hour or greater, we find that there's an 8.5% difference between these individuals. So for example, if you have in your door, I apologize, versus the other agencies. So the other agencies, we noticed that there's a little bit more than a 2% difference between individuals who happen to be of color, pulled over for speeding 10 miles per hour or greater and issued a citation versus white drivers who happen to be pulled over for speeding 10 miles per hour or greater and issued a citation as a result.
No, go ahead.
So here we're looking at searches based on the total number of searches that each individual agency conducts. Now there's a very small number of searches that are conducted for the most part by most agencies. But when we talk about searches that are based on officer's discretion, again, we're basing these numbers on those individual searches that are conducted as a result of a consent, result of probable cause, or a Terry frisk. Terry frisk, of course, being the smallest percentage, but we include those because, again, we believe that to be based on an officer's discretion. Here, as you'll notice, there are, again, some differences across agencies, and this varies from agency to agency. So here we're noting that individuals who happen to be of color and those individuals that happen to be searched during the study period versus those individuals who happen to be white and happen to be searched during the study period, there's about, for example, in Lawrence, there's a 3.1% difference between those individuals who happen to be of color and those individuals who happen to be white. The sheriff's office also illustrates a positive racial disparity where there's a 2.7% difference between those individuals of color who are searched and those individuals who are white who happen to be searched after being pulled over by an officer.
So we'll stay right here for a second, Matt. So as a summary of this part of the analysis and takeaway is that, we've worked with agencies all across the country, hundreds of them, and you do find some agencies where these differences that we're reporting here are much higher. We had an agency in Rhode Island where the differences were in the 20% range, and this was not this check was the absolute difference between the two numbers. And we also found that agencies have disparities in multiple measures, like we saw disparities in citations, we saw disparities in searches, we saw disparities in searches that didn't have contraband found. The one thing that I would say about Douglas County is that we didn't see any agency that had disparities across the board in all the measures that we looked at. But we didn't see any agency that didn't have any disparities that warranted some further investigation. So if you can see here, when we're talking about searches, you've got Lawrence and the sheriff's office that would warrant some additional investigation. Matt, could you go back one slide? And here we'd see the smaller agencies, Baldwin and KU, had disparities in citations of people with 10 miles or greater. So every agency has some place to sort of dig into and try to see if they understand it. At the same time, there wasn't an agency that had disparities across every one of the measures that we looked at.
Yeah, Chuck, you had your hand raised, and then I'm sorry, Shay.
Yeah, thank you. Could you give us again the the base? What's the search rate for white people, for example, and what's the search rate for people of color for both LPD and the sheriff's office?
So for example, for LPD, when we're talking about the discretionary searches, we're talking about 7.1% of those individuals who happen to be individuals of color versus 4% who happen to be white individuals.
Okay, thank you. And for the sheriff?
4.6 and 1.9.
Okay.
Sorry, Chuck, did you have a follow-up for that?
No, I'll just enter into the record what would be the conventional way in just a moment after I do the calculations, the conventional way of interpreting those numbers. Thank you.
Shay, go ahead.
I think I'm not understanding exactly what we're talking about in terms of the percentage. Chuck's way makes more sense to me, so I'm not sure I'm interpreting this correctly.
So for example,
no, go ahead.
Yeah, so for example, when we talk about Lawrence, right, we're specifically looking at the number of people who happen to be of color who are pulled over, right, as our baseline measure. So if we have a perfect world, we had 10 individuals who happen to be all individuals of color, and we have 80% of them issued a citation, 20% issued a warning. And then you have a different community of white individuals, and you have 100 people, and you have 60% of them issued a citation and 40% issued a warning, then there's a 20% difference between those two. So our expectations would be if I'm pulling somebody over for speeding 10 miles per hour or greater, and I give them a citation, and let's say if we were to able to control for other factors, and I pull somebody over who happens to be of color in that same location for speeding 10 miles per hour or greater, and I don't issue them a citation, our concern becomes, why did one person get a citation versus the other? Was it associated to race? So there's a difference between those individuals who happen to be issued a citation for that particular reason versus those who do not.
So I guess what I don't gather from this information, if it's included in these, is if you consider what the percentage of people of color is in the community versus the number of stops, is that incorporated into the difference or not?
So we don't use the percentage of individuals who live in the community because we don't have a good understanding if that happens to be a Lawrence resident, right? So given the fact that we have so many individuals that are coming in, for example, KU students, we can't use the census as an ideal measure. We would have to sort of weight it in with KU, which is our hope to do so, given based on the fact that the number of individuals who are actually residents of the county versus those who happen to be those outside of the county. Does that make sense, Shay?
It does, but so when I'm interpreting the numbers though, what I am assuming is that these assume that you should have equal numbers of people of color and white people on the street at any given time.
No, because it's not the stop. It's of those people who are stopped by the police.
Mm-hmm.
The assumption is, and this figure right here is their racial disparities in searches. So of the people who are stopped, the assumption would be that people should be searched on an equal rate. And so we're saying that that wasn't happening. So you don't need to know how many people are driving because it's the base is all the people who are stopped. And you say, what percentage of the people of color were searched and what percentage of white people were searched? And what we're saying in this slide is that in Lawrence, in the sheriff's office, there was a higher number of people, but the percentage of people searched of color was higher than the percentage of people searched of white folks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Chuck, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just give a quick illustration of the point that I'm trying to get at here. If among our CJCC membership that's present here today, there are 100 eggs distributed among us. Jack has 4 of them, and I have 2. There's a 2% difference by the way you folks are calculating the difference between your eggs and my eggs. But the way we would conventionally talk about it is you have twice as many eggs as I do, okay? That's the point I'm trying to make. And so by that conventional way of calculating these differences, the sheriff's office is searching in discretionary searches in stops, Black people at a rate about 2.4 times the rate of white people.
That is correct.
The Lawrence PD is searching Black people or people of color at about 1.8, which is effectively 2 times the rate of white people. And in the sort of scholarly literature in this area and the policy writing in this area, those are pretty substantial differences. A 2.5 times a higher search rate for people of color is a lot. A 2 times higher search rate for people of color is a lot. That's a big difference. It's the difference between 4 eggs and 2 eggs.
So we include both the ratios and the percentages. The percentage for our hope to better illustrate this lesson, but clearly the ratios would be also included, which is what you're calculating.
When you say you are including them, are you talking about in your report or in what?
That is correct. So in the report, so exactly what you said. So when we're talking about the sheriff, for example, it's a 2.7% difference, which is a 1.775, right? Times more likely for a person of color to be stopped, searched rather in this particular case based on their officer's discretion.
Right. I would just encourage you. So we're engaged in also a sort of an effort at public communication here or public information. And to calculate it as a difference in percentage when the base is so low is actually, in my view, somewhat misleading to the public about the significance of what we're finding here. It's a pretty radical departure from the way these kinds of numbers are talked about in every policy discussion in this area that I know of. I've never seen a calculation in the way you do without taking into account how, what the base is.
So we are including that understanding, but I understand what you mean by the interpretations of the numbers and how they are sort of spelled out in the policy pieces. I think for the most part, our hope that is in the final report, we will be including the ratios. This was hopefully to illustrate it, but we understand if it does entail something it does depict something very confusing otherwise.
Go ahead, Matt. And so this is the, and Chuck, I take your point and we will include that. This is looking at that final category of disparities where the search was conducted, but no contraband was found. Those were slightly more likely to happen to white folks in Lawrence, but much more likely to happen to people of color in the sheriff's office, deputies making stops. So you can see here that there are disparities, and we can redo them the way Chuck is talking about, and you'll see 2 and 3 times more likelihood of people to have these disparities counted against people of color.
So for example, when we're talking about the sheriff's office, we're talking about a 1.2 times more likely that individuals in the sheriff's office are more likely to pull somebody over, search them, and then find no contraband found during those discretionary searches. Specifically, when we mean officers using discretion, we're talking about, again, consent, probable cause, and Terry frisks.
So go ahead.
So when we're talking about sort of the next steps, this data that has been illustrated with sort of all the raw data has been provided to each of the individual agencies. We're particularly looking for those areas where we are seeing large disparities. When we talk about post-stop, when we're talking about those individuals who are issued a citation for certain types of stops, and those individuals who are searched and where no contraband is found. We are looking for more specific information on the location and controlling for the time of day. We're also looking for any other factors that happen to be involved, whether there's policies or practices that are found formally or informally from each of the individual agencies. And we're hoping to sort of develop some type of actionable items for each agency when we're talking about this, because we realize that a small number of officers are associated to the vast majority of stops and a small number of officers are associated to the vast majority of searches. We're sort of breaking it down to each agency at the individual level to better understand that information. That's the next slide. Do you want to talk about recommendations?
Sure. So finally, and I know we're coming up on time, the recommendations. One of the things that's come up in the conversations we've had with law enforcement so far is that they would like to have some finer distinctions made. So for example, you've seen in this disparities that there are disparities, and it's interesting sort of thing with Douglas County is a little bit different here. When we think about speeding 10 miles over, we're seeing, the literature talks about it, as Chuck is alluding to, that we see it at high discretion stops like equipment violations or rolling to a stop sign or something. But here, these would be defined as low discretion, which is you're stopped for speeding 10 miles over, and there's a disparity there. So one of the things to understand would be to maybe get some better gradations of what the speeding was. Is it 5 miles, 10 miles, 15 miles, 20 miles over? And if we were to collect that, people could understand whether or not it's the mileage versus the characteristics of the individual who's driving. The other thing about it is, we collected, and this was a joint decision by all the parties that were involved in deciding which data elements we collected. And now they know that there may be some things that we want to collect differently. So we're making a series of recommendations for how to change the form. One is we don't have as Janice said, we don't have the residents. All we have, whether it's Douglas County or not Douglas County, as the residents. I think we should be able to know what community people are in to be able to use that information. And basis of the stop, it's never good to have a lot of other categories. So we should add in, we're going to recommend adding in things like going through a stop sign or a red light as that. Finally, as we talked to this group the last time about, there has been a national movement now to try to deal with equipment violations in a more progressive way. And there's something called the Lights Out program, which has over 120 law enforcement agencies across the country in it. And basically what it does is it works with local automobile service agencies to provide a voucher system for people. So if somebody gets pulled over for having a headlight out, it isn't that they get 3 days to repair that, or they're going to have a citation, or they get a citation for that. It's that they get something that helps defray the cost of replacing the headlight that's out. And this is being done across the country. It seems like it's a wonderful opportunity to work with the community here. And as a matter of fact, the community of Wichita is one of the communities that is involved with this particular program. So one of the things that I think would increase trust between the community and the police is, participating in a program like this, where individuals were getting the opportunity to have some financial remuneration to help them in terms of dealing with the equipment violations on their car. So those are some of the initial recommendations we're talking about.
Do you want to go to the next slide? Yeah. Or we can close this share. Yeah. We just want to take, the next couple of minutes to sort of answer any other questions that individuals might have as we're sort of presenting this data to each individual agency to the CJCC.
Commissioner, yeah, go ahead.
This is Commissioner Portillo. I just want to thank you for this presentation, and I really appreciate the academic in me really appreciates the conversation between Chuck and our researchers about how these information are conventionally presented within the academic literature and how we're seeing them here. I think that there is kind of a public discussion that we need to have about what do these data really mean for our community, and the way that they are presented and the more conventional way that they're traditionally presented in the literature show that we do have pretty significant disparities within our community. And so I like the recommendation of the Lights On program. I think it works really well with some of the anti-poverty work that we've been doing throughout the county and trying to reduce fines and fees. But I also have some concerns about next steps and what do we do when it comes to data collection once the research project is officially over. And this is always one of the difficulties with engaged research of, do we have commitments from our local communities to continue to collect data long-term? We have some really good longitudinal data here that takes us from pre-pandemic through our current times, but I'm hoping to hear from the chiefs who are with us from Lawrence, KUPD, Baldwin, Eudora, and our sheriff, and hear a bit more about how you see this project moving forward in the post-research phase after we take these recommendations and implement them. How do we make sure that we're continuing to collect data and keeping a good eye on this and reporting that out to the public moving forward?
I'll say one thing from the researcher's point of view. We're working with Matt Cravens to make sure we can transition all of our data to Matt, all of the analyses we've done to Matt, so that he can continue to run those analyses and see if the disparities that are there, and we can report them any way we want, but the key goal is to reduce them. And, we don't want disparities. So, the question is, can we have a public dashboard, for example, that reports on these disparities and shows them declining over time?
And I think that's great. That ongoing progress piece is the one that's really important to me. And so how do we make sure that we have kind of the continuous data collection over time?
That's something you'd like me to respond to now?
I would like you and our chiefs of police to respond, Jay. Thanks.
No pressure, huh? No, so the sheriff's office, obviously, we've already indicated that we're going to continue with this. In fact, we've worked with Jack and Janice to even refine the form a little more. I have some, we're in a very, very tough space as law enforcement to continue to keep our ears open and listen to realities of our communities and perspectives, while understanding what these, like you said, understanding exactly what these numbers mean and show and say. I think that there is some transparency work that we can do on our end to help maybe explain some things, but I don't want to come across as an apologist or as this is an anomaly. Clearly the numbers show that there's work that needs to be done and issues that need to be looked at. And, from the sheriff's office perspective, we're committed to that. And I think we've been pretty clear on that. And I know that you and I have spoken at length about it. So I'll let the others speak for themselves, but we actually kind of look forward to continuing this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Mike Patrick, the Chief of Police of Baldwin City, and we have been fully committed with this project. I know our numbers are very small compared to the larger agencies, but we're still committed to moving forward even after this project is done. We've been fully committed to doing so. We rely upon the Douglas County Sheriff's Office quite a bit for our IT support when it comes to capturing that information, and they've been very gracious about helping us with that. So we do report our information through their portal. We'll continue to do that even after the study is done. We're committed to making our disparities numbers zero. I think anybody in this business has to make that commitment. And we have discussions with all of our officers routinely about our numbers if there's any type of unconscious bias, we want them to be aware of it. And so we're definitely committed to moving forward. So I just want you all to know that Baldwin City is completely on board.
Thank you. That's wonderful to hear. And I like hearing about the collaboration between you and Douglas County. That's fantastic.
This is Wes Levitt with you, Dorian. I reiterate everything that the sheriff has said and Mike from Baldwin. And I actually came from a department that has been doing this for 20 plus years. So it was something that I was kind of accustomed to, and I fully anticipate our agency being on board down the road.
Yes, this is Nelson Mosley with KUPD. I echo what the sheriff has already said and also the other chiefs. We're committed to, I'm also bound, the chancellor did a task force, also report that's out there online that we're committed to, which includes data and analyzing it. We haven't had our meeting yet, but I plan to also, I have a number of questions and thoughts on making sure we dive a little deeper on the numbers we're collecting for KU anyway. But we're committed to continuing collecting our data. We've been reporting it all along, and I echo what the other chiefs have said so far. That also includes, we've committed to conducting more training for our officers as well on various topics that are coming up. And we're also committed to get the disparities down to zero, hopefully, as well. So we are committed.
And it's Rich Lockhart from Lawrence PD. I do want to call attention to, though, several of the areas where the report indicated there were no disparities. So I think that's a positive for your Lawrence Police Department. And the other ones show areas where we need to do some further analysis. And I think a caution here, I come from Missouri where we've been collecting data in law enforcement for 21 years. I would really caution everyone about drawing conclusions just from the data at face value. This study contains individual officer data, and I think that's where we really need to drill down to see if there are disparities. I know in Missouri every year, the media would focus on it, the disparity index. And when you're looking at it there, you're looking at aggregate data for an entire department, and you can't really draw conclusions from that. So I think this is a unique study in that we do have the individual data. I've talked with Jack and Janice. We're talking about drilling down and looking at some of that in more detail. We have to do better at what we're doing. This is just one prong. It's not going to improve our relationships with the communities by itself. It's a part of a broader strategy of understanding one another, policing in a way that fits your community. Data collection is a very good part of that. But also, I think it's important to realize that data is limited, and it can only tell us so much. It can't get in the heart or the mind of an officer. And that's where we really have to try and get when we're talking about disparities and mistreatment of people of color. And that's where some of our training comes in. It's one of those things where I think it's important, and we're committed to it. I just hope that we're able to let the data lead us where it does, rather than try and take something and make the data fit that, if that's clear. So I was encouraged by some of it, got some work to do on a couple areas, but I do want to point that out because too many times when we do data collection and release data collection, everyone goes right to the negative. And I think there was some very encouraging things for Lawrence Police Department that need to be emphasized as well.
I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you all and your willingness to continue to collect the data and to refine the data. And I think it's important that data can be used to tell our story in its fullness. And so that means that things that are going really well in our community, as well as the areas where we need to improve. And so I appreciate that you all are committed to continuing to collect the data and continuing to look at making sure that we can work as a whole CJCC, as a whole community, and within each of the jurisdictions to do this work.
I think there's a few hands raised.
Darren?
Hey, yeah, I want to echo Commissioner Portillo and say thank you for this work, for the data. And one of the few things, Darren Kennedy, a community member. As a member of CJCC, I do think I want to pick up that thread that Shay and Chuck have brought up and connect it to the point about how this faces the community. One of the few things that few gifts that I have is tracking. And I do think that it was not an accident that we kind of hit, if not a snag, a place of further investigation around the notion of disparity. I think there is something around that slide of disparity, discrimination, and actually not making an assumption that we know what disparity means, particularly because of the way that it works in sort of social science. So and so I love kind of just like a further digging into or discussion of what we should be looking for and how to think about the word disparity and what it actually translates to, and where that relationship is or is not with discrimination, because I think that really is at the core of some of the things that we're trying to pick apart, particularly as we think about what this discussion means for Lawrence and Douglas County and Eudora and Baldwin and other folks within this community, what we're actually looking at. Does that make sense?
That does. Thank you so much, and we appreciate it. And I think our hope is with the final report to sort of use it as an opportunity to both educate the public and the police agencies on how best to use the data and how to interpret it, and what are the questions you should continue having. Because as a lot of the chiefs have said, data only tells you as much of a story as you have, but it also provides you an opportunity to monitor activity, right? It gives you a stepping stone from which we can continue to monitor officers' activities, agencies' activities, and how that compares within the county. So trying to illustrate that percentage in trying to make sure, as Chief Patrick said, making sure that that is sort of a zero, and if not, trying to identify who or what exactly is leading to that positive disparity is really what we're hoping to sort of fill in the detail, which is better illustrated in a report than it is illustrated in a very short presentation, right? So for us to provide the community both with a clear understanding of what do each of these numbers mean? When we get to a positive, what is driving that result where there is a positive racial disparity? There is a difference between individuals of color and individuals who are white, who are pulled over for certain reasons, and where those specific areas are being located. That's obviously an opportunity for us to better inform agencies on what they can do with the data moving forward, and community members, so they know what are officers doing in their community, why are they pulling somebody over, and giving them a citation versus a warning, right? Those are absolutely the things that we hope to sort of better illustrate in a written report than we have for all of a 30-minute presentation. Right? So thank you so much.
Sarah, I know we're running out of time. So Sarah, did you have a comment?
Just real quickly, I appreciate the chiefs speaking up about their commitment to continue to review the data. For coordination of the CJCC, you know, my team will look to work with the chiefs to have them continue to meet to sort of share results and maybe form, you know, we can discuss if that takes the form of a work group, or how do we want to sort of continue that collection and presentation to CJCC. So I look forward to thoughts from chiefs on how to do that at a later date.
Hey, this is Robert Benecki. Just early on in the process of the study, we presented to the community, or Jack and Janice did. We presented to other groups on what the study was about and where we're headed. And I know we're out of time here, but I just want to just ask the question to the CJCC on who, as we finalize this report, who and what groups, if any, do you want Jack and Janice in the community, or do a community presentation? And I'll just leave that question out there, and maybe we can have some more conversation over the next couple of weeks to get those things arranged.
And Robert, maybe it's something that folks could email you or Dr. Cravens if they're interested in having a presentation, or if there's more work. I know, like, I think the county commission would like a presentation on it. I'm assuming some of the different city commissions might like that presentation as well. So, but just if there are other groups, please just forward them to myself or Robert or Dr. Cravens, and we can help get that to Jack and Janice.
Thank you so much, Jack and Janice. Great presentation. Zaina, do we have any questions from the public?
Yes, and I'm moving them. Kristen?
Yeah, hi, everybody. Kirsten Kuhn here. I just wanted a quick little clarification on those slightly concerning numbers of just a small amount of officers making a whole lot of stops and searches. And I'm hoping that the various agencies will have access to the identities of those officers as the research comes available.
We've already provided that information, and we'll continue to work with the agencies to identify which of the officers are involved in those various activities. So absolutely.
I appreciate that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Any other questions, Zaina?
No.
Do we have
Actually,
anything else?
yes.
Okay,
My apologies. My apologies. We have Terry.
All right, I just wanted to say that we're only looking at the statistics on people pulled over. So I encourage local law enforcement to stop everybody speeding over 10 miles an hour. And we'll take a look at the race data once that has been accomplished. In other words, there might be people violating the ordinance who are not stopped. And the disproportion might be in greater stops of persons of color. But unless we clearly enforce the ordinance, we'll never know. So thank you.
I would need about another 500 police to do that. And I would love to do that because it would increase traffic safety, but that's a tough one to do.
I just encourage you to do the best you can to stop people speeding. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the public?
No, that's it.
Do we have anything else for the good of the order today? Seeing no hands raised, I'm going to adjourn this meeting. The next meeting of the CJCC is April the 12th. See you all then. Thank you.